Welcome to Future Consumer ADR, a podcast where we discuss what's happening and what's next in consumer and mass claims resolution. Hear from experts in their fields on the latest trends and innovations in consumer and mass arbitration, litigation, and beyond. My name is Adam Shoneck, host of the podcast. I'm a Vice President of Business Development for the American Arbitration Association. Today I'm joined by Colin Rule, CEO, founder, president, all things chief for ODR.com, who the AAA acquired in 2024, acquired ODR.com, just as a disclaimer. But Colin is the expert on ODR and helped build many systems, very famous systems that have been very successful. So welcome, Colin, to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Adam. Delighted to be here with you. I appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. So give us just a brief intro to your background, if you could.
Yeah, so I am what they call an NLM, a non-lawyer mediator. My whole career has been in mediation. I got trained initially by the Quakers. I went to a formerly Quaker school in Philadelphia called Haverford, and they did a mediation training. And my sophomore year of undergrad, I said, "This is it. This is what I want to do with my life." Now, at the time, there wasn't any technology really in the mediation process, so I was just, resolving roommate disputes and faculty-student disputes and things like that. But I wrote my thesis on collegiate conflict resolution and ended up, after graduation, working at the National Institute for Dispute Resolution in Washington. And that was really where I met a lot of the leaders in the dispute resolution field. So my whole career since then has been in mediation. I worked at mediate.com. I worked at the Consensus Building Institute. I did multi-party, sort of large scale mediation facilitation for a bunch of years. But I'm a nerd. You can probably tell just by looking at me. I love technology. I always have. And when we got to the end of the 90s, we started to see the internet crop up. And people were saying, well, how are we going to resolve disputes on the internet? And I thought, that's me. I'm the guy that should answer that question because I love mediation. I love technology. So I wrote a book called Online Dispute Resolution for Business that came out in 2001. And I did a couple startups along the way. I was the head of online dispute resolution at eBay and PayPal for 8 years. So we resolved a lot of buyer-seller disputes there. But fundamentally, that's sort of the way I see myself. I am the dispute resolution nerd, particularly the mediation nerd. How can we build software to help people resolve disputes? And that's what I'm 100% focused on. And I think there's a lot of synergy, obviously, with AAA and Bridget and all the exciting things going on. So I have a very good friend who's actually my CMO at ODR.com who said to me, Colin, you're like the dog that caught the car. You were talking about all this technology and dispute resolution stuff back before we had iPhones, back before we had social media, and it's all kind of it's come this way. So now we got AI. So we got to sort of figure out whatever crazy tech tools they put in the toolbox, I'll figure out how they fit in to the goals of ODR. So that's sort of my story.
Excellent. And I'm going to ask you about AI in a little bit, but just with the basics. So ODR is online dispute resolution, and
Mhm.
do you have a kind of base definition of what that is?
Yeah, so for a long time, we just defined ODR as ADR plus technology, right? So we would say information and communications technology applied to the task of resolving disputes. And when I say information and communications technology, a lot of people think that means the internet. And the internet is a very powerful information and communications technology, but there are other ones too. Like I think the standard telephone is a powerful technology for dispute resolution. So we got to think about how and when we should use that tool. I remember the first time I saw an LCD projector. It was actually in the EPA office in Washington, D.C. And I thought, oh my gosh, what an incredible dispute resolution tool this is because you can get a big room of people and you can all write a settlement agreement together. So every time new technology comes out, we in the ODR field think, okay, well, how does this fit into the work that we do? So it's not just about resolving disputes. I mean, that's sort of the core goal of ADR, but it's also about preventing conflict and managing conflict. Sometimes conflicts aren't ripe for resolution. They need to escalate before they start to move towards resolution. So we think a little bit more expansively in ODR. It's not just about trying, that disputes also imply, small disputes, and sometimes they're big disputes. I mean, I was on the Peace Tech Lab board, which was part of the United States Institute of Peace. We thought, how can we use technology to resolve violent conflict between nations? So I think that's also kind of under the umbrella. But if you look at the way courts have defined ODR, and a lot of the work I'm doing now is in the courts, they don't they feel like saying that ODR is ADR plus technology is a little bit circular because you got to know what ADR is before you know what ODR is. So
Hmm.
they've defined ODR as creating an online collaborative space where parties can convene to resolve their dispute, which I think, and I was involved in some of the working groups that came up with that definition. I like that definition. It does imply you're creating kind of a virtual resolution space that's optimized for that task. But one of the things that that leaves out is, as you mentioned, AI. You know, like if you're just creating a
Hmm.
room in virtual space like Zoom, like we can get on here and we can try and resolve our dispute, and that's ODR. But when you start to have the AI evaluate your case or coach you or reframe communications or do some of those things, that's not in that definition. So really we see in the ODR field, and it has become a field, a global field, there's a spectrum of no technology, zero technology in a dispute resolution process, all the way up to it's all technology. And you have online mediators, are AI-based arbitrators, maybe even the parties are algorithms, and they're arguing on behalf of their. So, and then most
Hmm.
processes are somewhere on that continuum. And I think so. I used to say ODR provides exciting possibilities for the future of ADR. Now I'm getting a little bit bolder, and I'm saying that ODR is the future of ADR, and it's almost impossible to find purely 100% offline dispute resolution processes anymore. Technology plays some role in pretty much every dispute resolution process. And the question is, as the technology gets more powerful, how can we leverage that power to be more effective?
You mentioned expanding the definition of what is a dispute, and I think that's important because a lot of times we think of a dispute as we're at the legal stage where this could go to court or possibly arbitration, or
Sure.
mediation is even a pretty advanced step in a dispute. But there could be disputes, as I've heard you talk about them, as small as I didn't get the right thing that I ordered, from this retailer or something like that.
Absolutely.
And talk about what tools are available for those kind of disputes and really what their benefit is.
Yeah, so it's a really great question. I think that online dispute resolution has opened up new possibilities for the dispute resolution field and how we engage with disputes. When I was first trained as a face-to-face mediator, my role was entirely reactive, right? The parties contact you and say, "Hey, we have a dispute." They've been trying to negotiate a resolution. They've probably reached impasse, and they say, "Look, we need some help." So that's when they reach out to me. The beginning of the process for me is kind of near the end for the parties, right? Because they had the
Mhm.
whole time where maybe they engaged in a transaction or they had an interaction and it went fine, but then it kind of ran off the rails and then a dispute arose. And then they tried to negotiate a resolution. Maybe they went back and forth and they reached impasse. And that's when they decide to reach out to a mediator. My friend Richard Susskind, who's the chief IT advisor to the Lord Chief Justice in the UK, he talks about sometimes it's cheaper to build a railing at the top of a cliff as opposed to hiring a bunch of ambulances to be at the bottom of the cliff. And I feel like mediation and arbitration for a long time, we were at the bottom of the cliff, you know? It's like we're
Sure.
trying to, when somebody gets hurt or there's a dispute, we come in and we try and react to it. But if we understand what's causing a lot of those disputes, we can move upstream and be a little proactive. And in many respects, the most effective form of dispute resolution is dispute prevention. And we had at eBay, for instance, as you say, lots and lots of people. I mean, because we did 60 million disputes per year at eBay, which is more than the US court system. And that was when I left in 2011, so I'm sure it's probably double that now. But a lot of those disputes were, hey, I bought an item and it didn't arrive, and I want to file a dispute. And we would say, okay, well, let's take a look. What item did you purchase, and where is the seller located, and what kind of shipping did you purchase, and is there a tracking number? Oh, there is a tracking number. It turns out they shipped it last week and it looks like it's in Memphis and it should be at your door in 2 days. Like why don't you wait 2 days and let's see whether or not the item arrives? And 95% of the time, the item arrives, and then we don't even need to file a dispute. We just sort of diagnose the problem. We didn't immediately presume that there's a disagreement between the two sides. We don't need to start a whole mediation arbitration process. Let's wait until the dust settles, and then we say, oh, okay, here's a path out. And we even had a lot of disputes over returns at eBay where somebody would get an item and they weren't happy with it and they wanted to return it. Well, the question is who's going to pay return shipping and is there going to be a restocking fee? And is it that the buyer just doesn't understand some of the quirks about the item that they purchased. So, what we did was we provided a lot more clarity up front before the buyer even saw the listing about what the return policy was, so that they knew that, hey, this is an as is no returns, purchase, or there is a $10 restocking fee, and that's why it's cheaper for you because, if you don't like it, you have to pay this fee to return it. And if they had that clarity up front, then when an issue arose later, there wasn't a dispute around returns because we had been proactive in addressing that and setting the expectation up front. So I think that this is an opportunity that ODR opens for us to move upstream and do more dispute prevention or early dispute diagnosis before we start the dialogue between the two parties, and they may start getting after it with each other. And then the item arrives, which was the initial irritant that created the dispute, but now they've already escalated it, so they want to keep going with the dispute because there's been mutual recriminations. So, that's some of what I've learned in dealing with these high volume, low value cases is the power of
So,
dispute prevention.
so there's prevention, and you're also facilitating that communication between the parties. And to kind of sum that up, basically, ODR.com
Yep,
is able to help companies set that sort of thing up, where um, these minor disputes could be prevented or managed before they ever got to, a later stage, which
absolutely.
I think is really fascinating, because we, like I said, expand the definition of what is a dispute, and then you figure out a way to solve it earlier, like the rail at the top of the cliff. So,
Yes,
um,
that's exactly right.
and those, I've heard you say, resolve most of disputes, and parties are really happy with that process. Is that
Yeah.
been your experience?
Yeah, I actually wrote a book for the American Bar Association called The New Handshake, Online Dispute Resolution and the Future of Consumer Protection. And I used a lot of the data that we generated at eBay and PayPal to look particularly at dispute and sentiment. And one of the things that we found is people want fast and fair resolutions. They don't necessarily want to just get paid out every time they complain because that doesn't really deliver justice. It's like, wait a minute, I think this seller kind of lied to me, so if eBay or Amazon or Buy.com or Airbnb or Lyft are just going to give me my money back immediately, how do I know that seller is not going to keep doing that? And how do I know that the other purchases that I make, I might not end up, I'm not going to end up in a similar situation? I need to know that these problems are being proactively addressed in a procedurally just, fair way. And that's why we built what we called at eBay and PayPal the Resolution Center. And so, we have resolutioncenter.com. We provide those kinds of services, turnkey services for lots and lots of different businesses. And really, any sharing, collaborative economy company where you have a marketplace for either services or tangible items, you're going to have disputes. And the main thing, if
Sure.
you ask users of those marketplaces, what is the job of the marketplace administrator? One of the first two or three things they say is, if we have any disagreements or disputes, we need to, the marketplace administrator should work them out. And that's why I liked working at eBay because eBay was not the buyer or the seller. They were in charge of making sure the overall marketplace ran efficiently. And part of that was, hey, if you have a problem, come to the resolution center, let us know, and we're going to work it out as quickly and as fairly as possible in a consistent, transparent way. Because that's also what the merchants who are selling lots and lots of items or lots and lots of services, they want to know that when a dispute arises, there's a clear process for getting it resolved so that the customer doesn't feel aggrieved. Because if people have a bad experience with a purchase, they're 10 times more likely to talk about it than if they have a positive experience. And now there's a lot of transparency around the performance of merchants and sellers in these marketplaces because there's public comments left by these buyers, and that can be really damaging to a seller's business. So providing fast and fair, consistent resolutions in a resolution center, and we built that at eBay and PayPal for e-commerce disputes, but airlines need resolution centers, and telecom companies need resolution centers, and insurance companies need resolution centers. Anytime somebody has a problem or they need something addressed, they need to have a centralized place where they can go in, report it, and get a resolution, a fast and fair resolution as quickly and as effectively as possible. And that's what ODR is all about. It's removing that friction. There are a lot of business plans that work great 99% of the time, but 1% of the time issues arise. And I've seen businesses be felled by that 1% because once word gets out that, hey, if you get a raw deal, they won't back you up, they won't take care of you, the customers are gone. And that's why these businesses invest heavily in resolutions because it's a crucial tool for customer retention and building trust with consumers.
And that's what I was most fascinated by, the customer retention aspect, how, taking care of these things quickly for and fairly will lead to better outcome. And to harken back to my episode with Federico Ast of Claros,
A good buddy of
they
mine.
ran that.
Yeah.
Yeah, they ran that program where so like 90% of the customers, because they thought it was fair and a good program,
Hmm.
accepted the results even if they lost. So, um,
Absolutely. And in that book that I mentioned, New Handshake, we share some of the data that's pulled out of hundreds of millions of eBay transactions because we had them all in our data warehouse, and we found that when people experienced a fast and fair resolution, they increased their usage of the site or service. So the reactivation rate was higher than somebody that didn't go through the resolution process. So what we found is even when somebody filed a dispute and they lost, they didn't get their money back, they still reactivated at a higher rate than somebody that never had a dispute in the first place. And of course, if they won, then they reactivated at an even higher rate in terms of coming back to eBay and PayPal again and again and engaging in more transactions. But the best react for all reactivation of all populations was when they could work it out with the seller. When, they said, "Hey, I have a problem," and the seller says, "No problem. I take care of my customers. Here's your refund. Here's your replacement item." When they did that, oh my gosh, the reactivation rate was much, much higher for those people because the next time they sit down to buy something, they go back to eBay because they had a positive resolution experience. And that bump, it was like 118% reactivation rate, was better than all of the marketing and brand marketing that eBay and PayPal spent hundreds of millions of dollars on. The result of that was on that individual customer was weaker than providing one fast and fair resolution that the customer felt was fair and easy to access. So that's why I say it's really valuable for businesses to invest in building resolution centers and delivering fast and fair resolutions to their customers because you get paid back for that investment in building the resolution system 10 times over through customer loyalty and reactivation. And that's what I share in the book is all the data behind that because we could back it up.
that's so fascinating and interesting. And I don't know why more companies haven't latched onto that process yet. But that's what this podcast is for. We're here
There
to
you go.
spread the news.
Spread
Um,
spread the good word, Adam.
yeah, exactly. So I want to shift and talk briefly about mass arbitrations. Um, obviously these high volume claims, most of them, when it's just the individual consumer, they can be resolved by, one of these other programs. But if you're getting a mass arbitration as a company, you may need something to help manage that. And that was
Hmm.
my thought for a custom sort of ODR platform
Hmm.
that could help manage those disputes. Uh, to talk about some of the things that ODR can build to help manage, a high volume of those kind of disputes beyond
Absolutely.
beyond that first phase.
Yeah, and this has been a passion of mine for a long time, and I've talked with friends at AAA about it, and even more widely. In the book, we talk a lot about class actions, right? And class
Mm.
actions are the mass claim solution of the judicial channel, right? Where somebody goes and certifies a class, and that happened to me. And in the book, I talk about eBay was the target of many, many, many class actions. And I even got a check one time in the mail for 1 penny. It was a 1 penny reimbursement. They spent 44 cents for the stamp to send me a check for 1 penny. Turns out I was curious, so I looked into it. They actually owed me 0.27 cents, which was
Hmm.
my share of whatever settlement from eBay over filing fees, payment fees. We called final value fees at eBay. So some two law firms got this class certified in Arkansas. They got a big settlement from eBay, and then they sent out, millions, presumably, of these checks. So, I was talking about, well, how satisfying is that to me as a customer? I never even opted into that class, right? They just sent me a check for 1 penny. But now, obviously, most consumer disputes, and the Supreme Court has signaled through various high-profile decisions like AT&T Concepcion and the Amex decision that they want to privatize a lot of these resolutions of these high-volume caseloads. So that's why we have, AAA is specified in 1 billion contracts per year. If you go get a cell phone or if you go get a bank account, it says, hey, if you have a dispute, we're not going to resolve this in the court. You're waiving your ability to participate in a class action, and you're waiving your ability to go to trial for this case. We're going to resolve this through arbitration, through a trusted provider like AAA. So, AAA gets lots and lots and lots of these filings, although there are some studies that show that consumers are reluctant to pursue redress when they realize their only option is arbitration. So there are ways that technology can make that easier too, right? If the arbitration process that's provided to a consumer is, a manual process, with a pretty significant filing fee because it's going to go to a case manager and there's going to be an arbitrator assigned. Sometimes the consumers just go, it's too much of a pain. I'm not going to pursue this. I'm not going to get a lawyer. But we are still seeing lots and lots of these mass claim arbitrations, these high volume arbitrations. And now we're seeing certain law firms in the United States that are aggregating these claims, right? So they'll find lots and lots of similar cases, maybe all DoorDash drivers that are all experiencing the same problem, or Amazon Echo owners that have the same concerns about privacy. And then these law firms will aggregate all of these cases, and then they use software to file a bunch of arbitrations at once. And it doesn't make sense to assign arbitrators and hear every single one of these cases because fundamentally they're the same case over and over again. I bought this Echo device and I didn't realize that it was recording little segments of me. So, and there are many, many examples of how this is going, and there's a lot of controversy around mass claim arbitrations. How could we do this in an effective way? Do we need to have class action type approaches in the arbitration space to mirror what's happening in the courts? Now, built a lot of ODR systems around the world, particularly in Europe, and most countries around the world do not have class actions. They don't have these kind of mass claim actions. They deal with these types of issues in a different way. And I think about particularly in the UK, where they don't have class actions, but they do have ombuds offices. So there's like a telecom ombuds and there's like a financial ombuds. And you can't compel a consumer to use arbitration to resolve a dispute the way you can in the United States. But these public agencies are empowered by the government to hear any complaint from any consumer within the industries that they regulate. So if your cable provider or your telecom provider doesn't take care of your concern, you can go to the telecom ombudsperson and you can file a case. Now, in the United States, we haven't traditionally used that type of mechanism, although we did have the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which kind of worked that way for the large financial entities that it regulated. And one of the ways that they deal with mass claims in Europe, which is very interesting, is they have what's called a tripwire. So if the telecom ombuds, for instance, gets a certain volume of cases that are complaints against, say, in the UK, British Telecom, and all of these complaints look the same, right? It's the same. I was mischarged for my subscription to this service. Well, you know what? We get 20, 30, 40, 50 of these complaints, and they're all exactly the same. Well, then what the telecom ombud says is, okay, now we've tripped the tripwire. So instead of requiring all of the people that might have been victimized by this billing error, we're now going to go to British Telecom and we're going to say, okay, now you have an obligation to do an investigation and figure out how many of your customers may have been victimized by this particular misbill. And then we, the telecom ombudsperson and British Telecom, we will work out a plan to figure out how to address that mistake and get a resolution. And as I say, in the United States, we had that for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So if you had enough complaints into the CFPB against Wells Fargo, for instance, CFPB would go to Wells Fargo and say, do an investigation, tell us how many people were affected, and then we'll do a settlement and we can distribute, the benefits to people. So that's sort of a public way to take these issues out of the judicial system and put it into an administrative process. So the question is, what can we learn from these different approaches in the mass arbitration space, right? Is there a way that we could implement a similar kind of tripwire mechanism? Or do we need to look at class actions and say, okay, and it might make sense, for instance, I know AAA has done this in the past, where you take one of these cases or a basket of these cases that all look very similar and you do like a bellwether case. And both parties agree, hey, if it's one law firm, it's representing 30,000 complainants and it's a business on the other side, we're going to decide this one case and we're going to presume that all the other cases are going to be handled in the same way, that first case that we decided. So that's another approach. But clearly, technology can make this process much less painful because you can lower the barrier to access to these redress processes by providing an online option. And any person who's aggrieved in this case can come in, provide their evidence in an online filing form, and there could be an algorithm that determines how much of the settlement they should be entitled to in order to, to pay them for the inconvenience or reimburse them for the cost that they incurred. So using technology at scale is a way that you can shorten the timelines, lower the barrier to access for the consumers, and potentially improve transparency around the process and save money on the business side and preserve some of these customer relationships because you can get a fast resolution that's perceived as procedurally fair. So I hit you with a lot there, Adam, and I know you're an expert in this too. So what do you think about all of that I just shared?
Well, yeah, I think when you engage the individual customer in that resolution process, it can be much more effective. What
Hmm.
I see are, clients represented by attorneys who, then you're going to communicate with their attorneys, and they are more pushing the issue of getting the mass into arbitration itself.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
um, I think where I think ODR could be useful in this space, really useful, is in okay, you have a mass arbitration. Please, claimants, use this platform and put that information in for us. Tell us who
Hmm.
your people are. You know, so that we can look at this, we can say, okay, yes, this person is an account holder. There's their
Hmm.
account right there. Uh, this person we don't, have a record of. And you can deal with a lot of these issues right up front, I think, by having an ODR platform where these disputes are sort of fed into for the company to manage uh, all that information.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and then they can do things like um, sending out custom templates on each of those cases, so they can do their own sort of case management for each of these matters that have been threatened against them. So
Absolutely.
um, you sort of managing it before it gets into the arbitration process, and maybe at that time, like you said, you do come up with either uh, an algorithm to determine how much each person is going to get as far as the settlement goes.
Hmm.
But it allows you to sort of get your arms around all of that data
Hmm.
and to sort of maybe resolve the thing before it goes further
I
in arbitration.
Everybody has an incentive, and consumers in particular want faster resolutions. And one of the challenges with some of the redress options that they're currently provided is it takes a long time, which is very frustrating and annoying. One of the things that I learned working at eBay and PayPal is oftentimes the resolution that the buyer desires is not a full refund. We had a circumstance, they released a video game when I was at eBay called Red Dead Redemption. It was a big game that everybody was excited about, and I think it was an exclusive for like a PlayStation console. But the problem was they packed so much data into this DVD that if the lens on your PlayStation console was dirty, when you put the DVD in, it couldn't read it. And we had customers sending back, filing disputes in volume. They really wanted to play this game, but they thought they got faulty DVDs because I mean, these things were all sealed in plastic, right? So they're all exactly the same. But they put it into their machine and the machine would say disk is unreadable. And they were returning, this was creating enormous costs for the merchants. And the merchants knew that the problem was they had a dirty lens on their PlayStation, but if the consumer wants to send it back and get a refund, eBay always empowered the consumer to do that because that was part of the consumer protection. But they wanted the working game. So what we actually did was we put together a packet of information, and these merchants started to send out lens cleaners for with the DVDs, and even to people that had filed disputes. Because they put in the lens cleaner as a little CD with a brush on it, it would clean off their lens, and then the disc would read. So oftentimes, what happens if you go into a formal redress process is you provide one option to the consumer, which is, okay, you paid for this, you're not happy with it, we'll give you your money back. But that's not what the consumer wants, and that's not what the merchant wants. So if you can be a little more creative in the resolution process, you can actually you can salvage the delight experience for the consumer. And there's another company in Brazil called eConciliador. Brazil has very, very generous consumer protection rules. And there's a queue of millions, tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of consumer disputes against businesses. And eConciliador, what they do is they provide a dashboard to businesses where the businesses can go in and say, look, these are the kind of resolutions that we would offer to these consumers. And then the ODR software goes out to all of the consumers and says, hey, you filed this case against this business back on this date. We'd like to offer you this offer to resolve the case. Do you want to accept this? And if they say, yeah, we accept, then it writes it all up and it closes the case, which is good for the consumer, good for the business. But even if they disagree with the offer, they want more money or they want more airline points or whatever resolution is offered to them, they can negotiate with the algorithm and go back and forth in this platform until they reach agreement. And then again, the platform writes it up. So this is in the interest of businesses because they have fewer pending cases against them. And every day that one of these cases is open, it costs businesses money. And it's also in the interest of consumers because they want to get a fast and fair resolution. So when an offer comes in the mail and they say, yeah, this is good enough, or hey, let's evolve this a little bit. Okay, now I feel really heard and I'm willing to accept this offer, then it doesn't have to advance to a full arbitration where an arbitrator has to come in, evaluate the evidence on both sides, and render a decision. When you're dealing with millions of cases, really manually addressing and resolving each one of those cases is not in the interest of the parties at all. Because it's just going to create delays and it's going to create inconsistency too, because you may have five cases that look the same and the arbitrator is going to decide different things in each case, just because they're going to see things slightly differently. So really what the market wants is consistency. They want to remove this friction. They want to find fast and fair resolutions. And that's what ODR is all about. So I agree with you. It absolutely makes sense to create sort of a pre-arbitration phase that leverages ODR to see if we can get a quick resolution, technology facilitated resolution, before we go into the more heavy duty, expensive, time consuming manual arbitration process. That can always be the backstop, but it should only be required in about 5% of the cases. I think 95% of these cases could be worked upstream. That's my opinion.
So to put it in perspective, the sort of the platform from ODR.com is like the lens cleaner. You're spending a little bit per case to resolve it proactively, and for you spend a lot more money to try to resolve it in arbitration. But I wanted to close with where we're going with ODR and maybe what the role of AI. We've talked about. No, you just talked about negotiating with the algorithm to get a better outcome for yourself. What is next in ODR when it comes to the technology aspect?
Yeah, we're very excited about artificial intelligence. In ODR, in the ODR academic side of the field, because I've taught ODR at multiple law schools over the last 20 years, there's a key concept in ODR called the fourth party. So if you think about the disputants as party one and party two, and you think about the human neutral, that could be a mediator, an arbitrator, an ombuds, a coach. That's the third party neutral. Technology is the fourth party. And even 20 years ago, we didn't even envision that technology would play the role that it's currently playing in terms of managing everybody's files and doing intakes and notifications and case management and even facilitating the negotiation with structured automated negotiation tools. All of those things are happening now, and they don't seem particularly science fiction-y at this point. And few people would want to go back to the world before the fourth party handled those kind of administrative responsibilities. But what AI opens up for the fourth party is it brings an additional layer of intelligence and capability. So we may ask the technology to evaluate our case. What's the value of this case? Or, what's the zone of potential agreement? Or go synthesize, go look at a million cases that are like this one and show me a distribution of what the outcomes were that were achieved. Maybe, it'll facilitate with filing, where instead of going in and having to provide all the detail about your case, you could just drag in a bunch of emails and documents and receipts and, okay, well, this is clearly the issue that you have, and here's an analysis of all the relevant rules and reimbursement policies. So AI is enormously helpful in streamlining. As I say, the goal of ODR is fast and fair resolutions. So being able to have a digital, and I know AAA is launching, our first digital arbitrator in November. The beauty of that arbitrator is it can respond 24/7 and it can analyze enormous amounts of information and bring in complex information. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a binding arbitration. It could be a non-binding evaluation or an offer that's put to both parties that they both accept, like an evaluative mediation or a settlement conference. So, as these tools get smarter, and it's not so much about where we are today. If you think about quantum computing and, all of the breakthroughs that are on the horizon, these AIs are going to get smarter and smarter and smarter and more powerful. I can even envision a future 5 or 10 years from now where the parties would prefer an algorithmic evaluation of their case over a human review, just because humans take a lot of time to get up to speed and read all the information and render a decision. So I think that the cultural acceptance of the role of AI dispute resolution is going to grow very quickly. And our ability to resolve, particularly these high volume, low value cases, which are just kind of an annoyance on both sides, I think people are going to grow to expect that resolution centers will be available to them 24/7 within the environments where they're engaging in these transactions. It'll just be a problem. Hey, I have a problem to report, and an AI will be able to come in, evaluate all the information, suggest a resolution, and the parties go, that sounds good to me, and then it executes it. So that's the future of these types of disputes. And putting that phase in at the start of a mass claim or a consumer arbitration makes a ton of sense. Because as I said, at eBay, we had 60 million disputes per year. We only had 25,000 employees. So we resolved 90% of those disputes in software only. And that was pre-AI. We just had intelligent systems that would ask kind of if-then questions and navigate people down a decision tree and find an appropriate outcome. Now we have the power of AI that can come in and look at all this detail and provide a reasoned award and evaluate evidence and say and apply all these policies. So that's going to be the new table stakes for delighting consumers. They're going to expect that's going to be available to them at any point. And whether or not that happens on the AAA side or that happens on the business side, where they provide that kind of algorithmic option of resolution, I really think it's going to become much, much more commonplace. And I'm super excited about how AI is going to just put a jet engine on the back of all the technology that we've been building over the last 20 years to provide redress for these high volume, low value kinds of disputes.
You said 5 to 10 years they might be adopting it. I think it'll be less than two, honestly. I think once parties see the quality of the awards that are produced, uh, they might, we will get to the point where it's better than a human arbitrator. They
Right.
can just write
Not even
more.
equivalent, but better. Yeah,
Right,
that's right.
exactly. And at that point, the adoption rate will be, sky high. So I wanted to thank you, Colin, for joining the podcast today and discussing ODR with us. This has been very fascinating. And thank you to all of our listeners for joining as well. So if they want to connect with you, LinkedIn, anywhere else they can
Just
connect with you?
send me an email, crule@odr.com, and would love to talk to anybody who wants to pursue these topics further.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Colin, and hope you have a good day.
Thank you, Adam.